Picking up from our last discussion on Durkheim, solidarity, and the events of September 11th, we now delve deeper into how Durkheim's work, particularly his analysis of the division of labor, inadvertently laid groundwork for a different kind of class analysis. We're going to unpack how he perhaps unintentionally developed a framework centered on the technical division of labor, explore how this might need tweaking for today's world, and see why this approach, while an improvement, still leaves some big questions hanging. Now, when we talk about Durkheim and class conflict, the usual critique is that he basically waved it away as a temporary blip during early industrialization. Thinkers like Zeitlin, Lockwood, and Baltimore pointed out that he seemed to ignore the lasting impact of these class divisions. And what did Durkheim argue? Well, he had two main ideas. First, he thought that as society matured, state regulations and professional codes would act like a moral brake on raw conflict of interest, what we now call institutionalizing conflict. Second, he believed that the rise of meritocracy, where success is seen as reflecting talent and effort rather than just luck or birth, would make inequality seem fairer, thus legitimizing it. Interestingly, these very ideas, regulation and meritocracy, became central themes in later discussions about how class conflict gets managed or tamed. It's almost like Durkheim was onto something important, even if his contemporaries didn't always give him the credit he deserved. This idea of institutionalizing conflict, where things get regulated and structured, really pushed later thinkers to step back from grand historical narratives about class. Instead, they started focusing on the nitty-gritty, explaining individual behavior today, like why people vote a certain way or live a particular lifestyle. The big question then became, are the old-school class categories from Marx and Friends, designed for big-picture history, actually useful for understanding these everyday choices? Most scholars said nope, not really. This led to all sorts of attempts to slice and dice the concept of labor into finer and finer pieces. But here's the catch. Many of these new categories were built on sand. They lacked real institutional backing, and defenders often relied on arguments that didn't quite hold water, like appealing to some abstract theoretical logic or claiming these groups would inevitably become powerful classes someday. It felt a bit like trying to build a skyscraper on a foundation of toothpicks. So, where does Durkheim fit back into this puzzle? He actually offers a two-pronged attack on the traditional view. On one hand, he gives us that negative macro story we talked about earlier. Big, overarching classes are destined to fade because of things like regulation and meritocracy. But, and this is crucial, he also tells a positive micro story. He predicts that smaller, more localized groups, what he calls gemeinschaftliche occupations, essentially occupational communities, will pop up right there at the workplace. These aren't just jobs, they're little social worlds with their own norms, values, and influence, shaping how individuals think, act, and live. Now, this micro-level story is often dismissed as irrelevant by class analysts. But hold on. The authors argue that these small classes can actually do things, embody characteristics, that we've traditionally only attributed to those big aggregate classes. That makes them incredibly important to study. Okay, let's be honest, Durkheim isn't exactly known for his detailed explanations of how things happen. He tends to be a bit quiet about the nitty-gritty mechanisms, the proximate causes, that lead to the formation of these occupational associations. He kind of assumes, through what Luke calls functionalist fiat, that whatever serves the system's needs will eventually win out. This leads him to blur the lines between what is normal, what is ideal, and what is about to happen. Compare that to Marx and his followers, who were all about the how, exploitation, conflicting interests, struggle driving historical change. Durkheim acknowledges some mechanisms, but he's rightly criticized for not digging deep enough into causes. So, the big question remains. Even with his methodological leaps of faith, does the end state he envisioned, this rise of local occupational groups, actually capture what's happening in our modern systems of inequality? So, what exactly did Durkheim predict would emerge at the production site? His book, The Division of Labor in Society, is best read not just as a critique of big classes, but as an extended discussion about the specific level at which production will be organized. When people summarize it, they often focus on the negative part. Big classes are temporary, destined to disappear. But the authors argue we should pay more attention to the positive part, the predicted rise of social organization at the local occupational level. Why? Because these local groups can actually take on class-like functions, and they can even crowd out or replace the formation of larger aggregate classes. Durkheim even went so far as to say these occupational associations would become the main type of group sitting between the state and the individual, pushing aside both Marx's classes and even older forms like the family. What would these occupational associations actually do? Durkheim saw them as having both informal and formal roles. Informally, they'd foster bonds among members. Formally, they'd be expected to set up ethical codes for the profession, sort out disputes between members or with other groups, and even serve as basic representatives in politics. Crucially, he argued these functions work best locally. You can't effectively regulate something if you don't intimately understand it, right? He pointed to historical examples like medieval guilds and modern professional bodies. What struck Durkheim was their long history, appearing almost as soon as there were trades. This longevity, he reasoned, suggested these groups had some fundamental timeless purpose. One key function Durkheim highlighted was containing egoism. Remember how he worried about the breakdown of traditional societies, leading to excessive self-interest? He thought these occupational groups could help rein that in. How? By getting workers to adjust their ambitions based on what's realistic within their specific occupation, rather than chasing unattainable goals. It's like saying, hey, aim for a promotion within your department, not necessarily CEO of the company tomorrow. This creates a new kind of authority, an extra individual one rooted in the occupation itself. This ties back to his broader argument. As these local groups gain power and legitimacy, they undermine the unity of any potential big working class and make workers accept wage differences, including those between different big classes, as justifiable. It's a subtle but powerful way of making inequality seem less threatening. This brings us to Durkheim's famous problem of order. As societies differentiate and specialize, will we lose all sense of community and shared values, leading to chaos? Durkheim's answer involved two parts. We've discussed the first. These new occupational sentiments, creating a kind of mechanical solidarity at the local level. The second part is often overlooked. The rise of occupation-specific beliefs and values that also bind people together, countering the forces of individuation. Think about it. Doctors have doctor norms, lawyers have lawyer ethics, engineers have engineering standards. These aren't necessarily totalizing like old religious systems, but they are powerful and imperative within their own spheres. This leads to what Durkheim called moral polymorphism, a society with multiple centers of moral life, each tied to a different occupation. So, order isn't just maintained by abstract national values, it's also maintained by these localized, specialized moral communities. This idea of moral polymorphism wasn't just Durkheim's own fancy. Later French sociologists ran with it. Bouglé looked at the Indian caste system and saw it as an extreme example, where these occupational communities were incredibly rigid, hierarchical, and self-contained. He called it a unique dilation of universal tendencies, meaning it's an exaggerated version of something that happens everywhere. Halbwachs also talked about how different occupations develop their own distinct traditions and ways of thinking, using examples from various detailed jobs. And Bourdieu, in his classic Distinction, showed how people's lifestyles and tastes are shaped by their detailed occupations, like being a professor versus a nurse, even though these occupations only imperfectly reflect broader social positions. The point is, these detailed occupational cultures are where much of our distinctiveness comes from, not just broad class labels. Durkheim himself described occupations as having their own cultures, ideas, customs, ways of seeing things, absorbed almost unconsciously, like breathing the air. So how do these occupational cultures actually form? Durkheim pointed to a few key processes. First, self-selection. People with similar backgrounds, skills, or interests tend to gravitate towards the same jobs. Second, once you're in, interacting with colleagues reinforces and elaborates these shared tastes and beliefs. Think about the inside jokes, the preferred restaurants, the common jargon. It all develops through daily interaction. Third, people in the same occupation often have overlapping interests, which can be pursued collectively by aligning with the group. If these communities of practice become strongly localized, then figuring out why people think and behave the way they do requires looking at these local occupational levels. In fact, Durkheim is describing a situation where class and status group, or stand, merge at the detailed occupational level, something Max Weber noted rarely happens with broad aggregate classes. Durkheim's solution to the problem of order has two parts. We've covered the first part. These shared occupational sentiments creating mechanical solidarity. Now the second part involves organic solidarity, which comes from interdependence. Remember the old worry, going back to Adam Smith and Auguste Comte, that specialization makes work boring and alienating? Durkheim offered a counter-argument. If workers constantly interact with others doing related jobs, neighboring functions, they start to see how their specific task fits into the bigger picture. They realize their work has a purpose beyond themselves. So, extreme specialization doesn't have to be alienating if people understand and appreciate their contribution, however small or repetitive. Again, this local perspective, focusing on visible cooperation, subtly undermines interpretations of work purely in terms of hidden exploitation at the macro level. This organic solidarity, this interdependence also shows up normatively through regulation. Durkheim saw occupational groups as the main drivers of setting rules for the workplace, especially concerning labor-capital relations. Because they're closest to the action, they're best equipped to create sensible codes of conduct and define how work is divided. In early industrial times, without proper regulation, things were chaotic, leading to unresolved conflicts and making radical ideas like socialism attractive. But as Durkheim predicted, regulation would eventually develop, perhaps spontaneously through negotiation, and get codified into law. Once that happens, he argued, the appeal of revolutionary programs fades. This normative regulation, again, acts as a form of micro-level organization that hinders the development of large-scale, macro-level class movements. So, was Durkheim right about all this? It's interesting that while we constantly test Marx and Weber, Durkheim's arguments about the rise of local organization haven't gotten the same scrutiny. Many see his division of labor as just old history, not relevant anymore. But think about the labor market today. Hasn't it become increasingly Durkheimian? Industrial conflict between big classes seems largely contained, and instead, we see occupational groups becoming the fundamental building blocks. Look around. People talk about their careers in terms of their job title. Schools train people for specific occupations, and employers list jobs using precise occupational titles. As Trayman, Parsons, and Walensky noted decades ago, the whole system is occupationalized. What fueled this occupationalization? Several things. The professional sector has grown massively, bringing with it strong professional associations. New types of jobs, often requiring specialized abstract skills, have emerged, along with their own associations. Think it specialists, data scientists, UX designers. Then there's the widespread use of licensing, certification, and registration, which act like gates controlling who can enter certain occupations. And finally, local labor unions, like the American Federation of Teachers, have often strengthened as broader, more encompassing labor movements have weakened. Krauss nailed it way back in 1971. Historically, there's been more consciousness and action around specific occupations than across them. Looking back, may be true, unified class-wide organization was just a fleeting moment in history, and we're seeing a return to more local, sectional forms of organization, exactly as Durkheim suggested. Now, let's not get carried away. Durkheim was remarkably insightful, but he did overstate things a bit. His formula isn't perfect. Where does it fall short? First, multifunctionalism and competing forms. Durkheim imagined these occupational associations taking on a huge range of roles, regulating everything, providing community, even running politics. Reality is messier. Today's associations are often quite narrow, mostly lobbying for things like training rights, and they compete fiercely with unions. The state is still the big player. Second, incomplete occupationalization. Not all sectors are fully occupationalized. Think about many low-skilled manual jobs, where strong, recognized occupational groups haven't really formed. Will they ever, or will they just fade away? It's unclear. Third, cross-national variation. Look at Table 13.1 in the text. Germany looks pretty Durkheimian, with its strong vocational system creating closed occupational groups. Japan looks almost the opposite, with its emphasis on firm-specific skills and weak craft unions creating a post-occupational system. And Sweden? Craft unions gave way to class-wide bargaining, showing that aggregate class formation, which Durkheim thought abnormal, has actually persisted there. So, the picture is complex, and Durkheim's model isn't universally applicable. Given all this, if we accept Durkheim's interpretation, how should class analysis change? The authors propose two big shifts. First, ditch the obsession with finding big aggregate classes. Stop treating that as the ultimate goal of class analysis. Second, shift the focus down to the local level, specifically to these unit occupations which have been ignored or dismissed. Why? Because the current way of doing class analysis is problematic. Scholars often create categories like semi-traditionalized supervisors or routine non-manuals. These categories might sound analytically neat, but they lack real institutional weight. How do employers or employees actually use these labels? Often, the justification is purely exegetical, fitting the category into some theorist's framework, or it's a latency claim, hoping these groups will magically become real classes someday. Sometimes they point to explained variance, showing the category predicts some outcomes, but these tests are often weak. This whole approach relies on looking beneath the surface for deeper truths, but it ignores the fact that the surface, the actual institutional reality, has changed. Historians used to work with deeply embedded categories like castes or estates. Why not sociologists today? So if we follow Durkheim, where do we start? With the unit occupation, what is this? It's a group of technically similar jobs that are institutionally defined. How do we know they're institutionalized? Because there's usually an association or union representing them. There are licensing or certification requirements to get in. Or there's a widespread understanding among employers, workers, and others about how production should be organized and who does what. These boundaries often come from turf wars, struggles between different groups trying to carve out their own niche in the division of labor. Granovetter and Tilly put it nicely. Our rigid sense of who does what orderly, nurse, doctor comes from legal, political, and economic battles. This contrasts with how statisticians often define occupations, just grouping jobs based on technical similarity. That's not enough, because technically similar jobs could be grouped in countless ways. The key is the social boundary, the institutionalization. Of course, defining these unit occupations is tricky in sectors where such boundaries are weak or non-existent. Okay, fine. Someone might say, studying these local groups is great for occupational researchers. But class analysts are supposed to be thinking bigger, right? This reaction misses the point. These local occupational groups actually exhibit behavior that looks remarkably like what class theorists have always wanted to find in big classes. They act collectively, they defend their turf, they extract benefits, they shape people's lives and identities. If you want to show that modern economies aren't smooth, frictionless markets, but lumpy collections of competing groups, you need to look at these local occupational associations. The purpose here is to show that the key processes class analysts look for identification, closure, collective action, structuration actually happen, perhaps more clearly, at this disaggregate level, precisely where the old aggregate approach has struggled. Let's start with identification. Both Marx and Durkheim thought that old ties based on ethnicity or region would weaken as societies modernized. And it seems like they were right about that. People today don't seem to identify strongly with big classes. Surveys show few people list class as a very important identity, and asking people open-ended about class often gets confusing answers or denials. So class is seen as passive, not a core part of who we are. But wait, the authors argue this conclusion ignores the power of class analysis if we broaden its scope. Look at the same surveys. Detailed occupations are one of the main social identities people use. Qualitative studies confirm this, showing how deeply tied people feel to their jobs. Why? Because we constantly ask for and use occupational information. It's everywhere. The language of occupation is common currency, while the language of class is mostly confined to academia. This subjective reality points towards the importance of the local level. Next up, social closure. This became a big deal in sociology, focusing on how class membership is restricted to the qualified. Think credentials, licenses, property ownership. Closure theory gives us a language for understanding inequality, but here's the twist. Even when armed with closure theory, analysts often default back to those familiar aggregate categories. Parkin, for instance, proposed a simple two-class solution: the controllers and the excluded. This reveals a kind of intellectual inertia, a difficulty imagining alternatives beyond the big class framework. If closure theory were truly reinvented without this baggage, it would likely focus on the real working institutions of closure. The professional associations, the craft unions, which are, by and large, local organizations representing credential holders. The mechanisms like licensing and apprenticeships operate at the detailed occupational level, controlling who gets in and out of those specific jobs. There aren't analogous systems operating at the aggregate class level. For neo-Marxists, closure was interesting because it was supposed to lead to class-wide interests and big struggles between classes. But as we know, aggregate classes haven't exactly been mobilizing according to script. This led to various attempts to salvage the theory, and later, a postmodern turn arguing that interests are now defined outside of work. But this overlooks the fact that collective action flows naturally from structurally defined groups, provided we define those groups appropriately at the local level. At the unit occupation level, we see downward closure, trying to keep outsiders out, lateral competition, fighting over different niches, and upward action, bargaining for better deals. This focus on instrumental micro-level action is perfectly compatible with a Durkheimian view. Durkheim himself took these practical concerns for granted and focused on the more subtle extra-economic functions of these groups. While analyzing these smaller groups might seem modest, it's worth noting that aggregate class analysis has also scaled back its ambitions considerably. Finally, proximate structuration. Much of contemporary class analysis aims to show that class membership affects individual outcomes, attitudes, voting, lifestyles. This is often done by looking at the effects of aggregate classes, or by measuring job dimensions or detailed occupations. But this approach tends to ignore the Gemeinschaftlich, the community-like, nature of some of these detailed occupations. As we've argued, modern closure operates at the detailed occupational level, restricting interaction and fostering distinct occupational subcultures, just like Durkheim described. Aggregate classes, on the other hand, have no real power over secondary socialization, and any aggregate culture that emerges is much more diffuse and abstract. The big failing of conventional analyses is treating these rich, meaningful occupational cultures as mere labels to be aggregated or averaged out. When critics complain that class effects are weak, it's often because they're using blunt, overly aggregate measures, not because the influence of the site of production is inherently weak. So, if these detailed occupations are acting like socio-political communities, maybe we can find a Durkheimian model of exploitation there too. Instead of searching for big aggregate classes, we look at the local level. Much of the literature focuses on skill-based exploitation, often equating it with rent extraction. The idea is that skilled workers earn more than unskilled ones, and if this difference exceeds the cost of acquiring the skills, then something exploitative is going on. Perfect competition should eliminate such excess returns, but barriers to entry, like limited training spots, disrupt this flow and allow rent to be captured. Think about doctors. Their high pay might be partly due to deliberately restricting the number of medical school places. This concept of skill-based exploitation has roots in Durkheim's thinking. Indeed, Durkheim himself railed against constraints on free mobility. He pointed to two types: explicit restrictions like caste systems or gender norms dictating which jobs people can do, and economic barriers like high costs of training that keep lower-class workers out of desirable fields. Both kinds of forced mobility reduce workers' bargaining power because they can't easily threaten to leave. As Durkheim put it, if one group is forced to take any price while another can walk away, the latter has an unjust advantage. His solution? Open up opportunities, remove legal and normative barriers, and even consider intervening in the market to prevent wealth from being passed down to give kids an unfair head start in the job hunt. This anticipates modern ideas about exploitation, recognizing that bargaining power depends on supply and demand within occupations. However, Durkheim focused more on the unfairness of restricted mobility than on the rent itself, and more on the wages lost by trapped workers than on the profits gained by those restricting supply. So, how can we improve our models of skill-based exploitation, drawing on Durkheim? Since modern closure mechanisms, like professional associations and unions, operate locally, it makes sense that rent extraction primarily happens at the local level. Neo-Marxians often talked about big exploitation classes, assuming workers in similar structural positions across different occupations would share interests and unite. But the problem is, these big classes don't really exist institutionally. The real organizations controlling access and extracting rent are the occupational ones. Therefore, the basic units of exploitation are the occupations themselves. Neo-Marxian classes are just heterogeneous collections of these occupations, grouped together because they supposedly face similar exploitation. It's possible that exploiters in different occupations might eventually band together to protect the systems that enable their rent. But for now, the disaggregate view seems more accurate. Conventional big class maps are hypotheses about future simplification, not descriptions of the present structure. The really fundamental question is whether this underlying structure of rent extraction shapes how we understand and fight for our interests. From a neo-Durkheimian perspective, the academic definition of skill-based rent might not be how most people think about it. Despite the existence of forced mobility and potential exploitation, we often hear countervailing stories justifying wage differences. Durkheim saw this coming. Societies develop consensual beliefs about what rewards are appropriate for different jobs. So the occupational structure is a double-edged sword. It extracts rent on one hand, but on the other it legitimizes that rent, convincing us it's fair. How? Through arguments about functional necessity, the inviolability of the market, or compensating for difficult work. The result? We tolerate huge differences in pay between occupations, but scrutinize differences within the same occupation, especially if linked to race or gender. Anti-discrimination laws target intra-occupational gaps, while comparable worth, which challenges inter-occupational gaps, has struggled. Understanding this dynamic is key. So, wrapping this up, Durkheim's insights about the rise of local occupational groups and their implications for class analysis are incredibly valuable. It suggests we need to shift our focus away from the obsession with big aggregate classes and look more closely at the micro-level dynamics of these unit occupations. Doing so could lead to more powerful explanations of social behavior, more realistic models of how people move up or get locked out, and ultimately, a revitalized approach to class analysis. Understanding the dual nature of these occupational structures, how they both extract rent and legitimize it, is absolutely crucial for grasping the complexities of inequality in our current world.